Julia Harper hadn't intended to return to California, let alone to the coastal development her late uncle had once described as a cul-de-sac for retired ambition. But when the letter from the estate lawyer arrived, crisp, formal, printed in muted ink that seemed almost ashamed of its own contents, she knew she no longer had the luxury of choosing between options. Life had done what life always does when you're vulnerable. It removed the illusion of choice and left only necessity. The house on Larkspur Lane, surrounded by manicured shrubs and overseen by a neighborhood committee whose bylaws rivaled federal code in complexity, had belonged to her Uncle Charles, a reclusive but dignified man who'd made a career in applied acoustics and left the rest of his affairs in equally meticulous order. His passing had been quiet, and so was the transition of the property. The only condition, she had to live in it for at least 1 year before deciding to sell. Not rent, not flip, live. At the time, that felt like salvation. Whoa. After the mess of a high-profile divorce that had left Julia's reputation bruised and her finances hemorrhaging, the idea of a paid-off home, one with no mortgage, no pending liens, and a zip code that still carried weight in real estate circles, was the kind of lifeline you didn't question too deeply. She moved in with her son, Elliot, age 7, whose cautious optimism reflected both his mother's exhausted pragmatism and the sense that he, too, understood on some instinctual level that they were treading carefully into new territory. He didn't complain about the move. He didn't ask about his father. He simply took his favorite stuffed whale and sat in the back seat as they drove into their new life. Larkspur Lane greeted them with forced warmth. The neighbors waved, some smiled, a few approached under the guise of welcome while probing with sharp social questions designed to triangulate status. Julia played along, but not too much. She knew the dance. She had once been married into circles where this sort of subtle interrogation passed for charm. Still, the first few days passed uneventfully. She enrolled Elliot in the local school. She made lists of repairs to tackle and groceries to restock. She even had a brief conversation with a local contractor about fixing the overgrown hedges and possibly updating the gate, which had developed a stubborn rust along the hinges. It was all very ordinary, painfully so. But after the whirlwind of legal battles, custody arrangements, and silent betrayals disguised as negotiated settlements, ordinary felt like a victory. Then came Karen. Karen Lionel was the sort of neighbor who didn't need to raise her voice to make herself heard. She was in her late 50s, with a posture that spoke of Pilates, a wardrobe of neutral earth tones, and a way of speaking that made even compliments sound like court summons. Julia first encountered her on a Sunday morning while sweeping leaves from the porch. Karen didn't smile as she approached. She simply nodded, as though this was an audit rather than a conversation. "You're the new occupant of number 12, she said, not asked, and Julia, recognizing the tone, replied with equal firmness. That's right. Karen didn't offer her name right away, nor a handshake. She instead surveyed the property like a judge deliberating over a case. Then, after a pause that lasted just long enough to suggest significance, she added, "This house was originally designated for a family with a different profile. The board had alternate recommendations, but the estate intervened, I'm told." Julia blinked, caught off guard not by the content of the statement, but the gall of its delivery. "I wasn't aware the neighborhood committee handled residency assignments like a boarding school." Karen's lips curled, not into a smile, but something adjacent, an expression that wore the shape of amusement but none of its warmth. "We have standards. Standards exist for a reason. If we didn't maintain them, communities would change." That last word carried the weight of something unsaid, and Julia felt a subtle chill despite the morning sun. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Karen turned and left without further ceremony, but the message had been delivered with textbook precision. You are being watched. You are being measured. In the days that followed, things unfolded like the opening act of a play you weren't sure you'd agreed to star in. A note appeared in Julia's mailbox, not from the post, but tucked loosely, unsigned on cheap stationery. It read simply, "All properties are conditional." She dismissed it as neighborhood paranoia, maybe even a misdelivered piece meant for someone else. Then came a gentle reminder from the committee that the mailbox paint was not in compliance with current color codes. Then a polite inquiry into whether Elliot's backpack, decorated with bright cartoon sharks, might not be too visually disruptive for a neighborhood with a natural tones policy. Each notice framed as a request. Each request a provocation disguised as civility. Still, Julia didn't react. She complied when it made sense, ignored what didn't, and made sure to log every interaction in a notebook she kept tucked into the kitchen drawer. Not for revenge, not even for defense, but because she had learned the hard way that memory could be. Bent, but paper did not lie. The first real crack appeared 2 weeks after moving in. Elliot came home from school quieter than usual. Julia asked how his day had been, and he shrugged. Later that evening, while brushing his teeth, he said, almost offhandedly, "Miss Karen says you're not a real mom." Julia had to steady herself on the doorframe. "She said sometimes people take things they don't deserve," he added, "and that sometimes it's okay to give them back if someone better comes along." It was the kind of sentence that doesn't just sting, it detonates. Julia didn't know whether to rage or cry or call a lawyer. She did none of those things. Instead, she crouched, kissed Elliot's temple, and said, "That's not true, and I'm sorry she made you feel like it was." She knew then that this wasn't about property values or community standards or architectural conformity. This was personal. The house, the child, the silence surrounding both. Karen had decided that Julia had taken something she wasn't entitled to, and she wasn't going to stop until balance was restored. But Julia wasn't going anywhere. Not this time. She had given up enough already. Her peace, her marriage, the years she'd spent trying to be small enough not to provoke reaction. This house might have started as refuge, but if it came to it, she was ready to make it a fortress. And Karen? Karen was used to winning without confrontation. That was about to change. Julia had learned long ago that there were different types of silence. There was the stillness of early morning when even the wind seemed to hold its breath, the peace of Elliot's slow, steady breathing in the dark before dawn, the hush of snowfall that softened even harsh city lines. And then there was the other kind, weaponized, ambient, the kind of silence that hummed with accusation and surveillance. That was what she felt now, walking through her own front yard, watering the flowers her uncle had planted long before she'd arrived, when she noticed the glances. They weren't overt, they were half-glances, neighborly smiles that stopped just short of reaching the eyes, conversations that ended when she approached and resumed in murmurs once she passed. Emo. In another context, it might have been paranoia, but here it was, math. She counted the pauses, the clipped tones, the identical phrasing in multiple courtesy notices, folded into her mailbox like little origami threats. There was a pattern. And Julia, though no conspiracy theorist, knew how patterns worked. They indicated orchestration. The real shift began with a certified letter. It was thick, printed on textured paper, sealed in an envelope that carried the slight chemical tang of toner and urgency. Delivered on a Friday afternoon, it bore no return address, but inside it carried the distinct scent of power playing by its own rules. The document, densely packed and vaguely legal in tone, was titled Notice of Evaluation, Property and Residency Status Review. The language was bureaucratically labyrinthine, but the implication was pointed. Her claim to the house was being reviewed due to an irregularity in reassignment procedures and concerns expressed by multiple long-standing members of the neighborhood community. The phrasing was exact, cold, and dangerous. She wasn't being evicted, not officially, but her status was now under internal review. It would have been laughable had it not been so well timed. The day before, Elliot had been sent home from school with a note pinned to his backpack, handwritten by the assistant principal, stating that there had been an anonymous inquiry regarding his emergency contact information and custody status. The note claimed this was routine due diligence, which might have been believable had Julia not just been mailed an unrelated inquiry into the legitimacy of her living in her own home. Two parallel coincidences did not a conspiracy make, but they certainly indicated choreography. Julia took the letter to her lawyer, Marcus, a quiet, composed man with a mind like a scalpel and an affinity for iced green tea. He read the notice in silence, then reread it, then finally looked up and said, "They're not challenging your deed. Not yet. They're trying to set precedent for a pattern of concern. If enough of these add up, they can recommend a forced arbitration review under neighborhood charter rules." That's rare, but it's not nothing. She asked what that meant in practical terms, and Marcus replied simply, "If they manage to get traction on this, they can create enough of a paper trail to make your position look unstable. It won't hold up in state court, but it might be enough to get child services curious." He didn't say what that would mean for Elliot, but he didn't have to. Julia knew exactly how thin the ice beneath her was and how skilled her enemies were at making it crack without ever appearing to stomp. Karen's role in this wasn't overt, not yet, but her fingerprints were everywhere, smudged like greasy shadows along the perimeter of each incident. She had positioned herself as a protector of community standards, a benevolent enforcer who simply wanted things to remain as they should be. She never raised her voice. She never issued commands. She suggested. She forwarded concerns. She was quoted in minutes as having brought to light issues, never instigated them. Her genius lay in plausible deniability, a predator disguised as an advocate. Still, Julia didn't engage directly. She continued her life as if none of it were happening, but she tightened routines. She walked Elliot to school rather than let him take the bus. She ensured every document, school forms, medical records, after-school permissions, were duplicated, notarized, and backed up threefold. She contacted the school superintendent's office and requested a formal review of the assistant principal's actions, phrased diplomatically but loaded with veiled legal precision. She called the city zoning department and asked, with pleasant professionalism, for a copy of the original reassignment plan for properties transferred due to disaster recovery measures. Every call, every form, every move, measured, calm, traceable. But the war wasn't just on paper. Karen began appearing more frequently, never unannounced but always uninvited. She passed Julia during morning walks and commented on Elliot's lunch choices. She arrived at community forums with folders, which she held just tightly enough to suggest importance, and always left before the Q&A, having delivered whatever message she needed without opening her mouth. Your neighbors grew more distant. The barista at the local cafe, previously friendly, now avoided eye contact. The maintenance crew scheduled for Julia's plumbing job rescheduled 3 times, then ghosted entirely. The insulation was starting to fray. Then came the unthinkable. Elliot's teacher, Mrs. Grayson, a warm, middle-aged woman with a fondness for picture books and consistency, called Julia on a Wednesday afternoon. Her voice was neutral but careful. She informed Julia that Elliot had been pulled aside by a school counselor after a student overheard him saying he was scared to leave the house. Julia felt the floor tilt. She asked for context. Mrs. Grayson didn't have much, only that the counselor had filed a mandatory report citing possible emotional neglect. Not abuse, not misconduct. Emotional neglect. Julia's head throbbed. That word, soft, ambiguous, insidious, had the potential to rupture everything. Marcus, when told, did not blink. They're trying to paint you unstable, not dangerous. Just unfit. That's the angle. It's more effective. Easier to believe. Easier to escalate. He began drafting a counter-motion that would request a full review of the complaint's origin and an investigation into who exactly was feeding the school misinformation. But Julia knew better. By the time truth caught up to rumor, damage was already done. That evening, as Elliot slept, Julia sat in the kitchen and stared at the walls of the house. Walls her uncle had painted in tones of ivory and rust. Walls that had held a family before hers, that had seen peace before this siege. She knew now, unequivocally, that this was not simply resistance to her presence. It was reclamation. Karen believed this house was meant for someone else, someone vetted, someone worthy. And Julia, by virtue of divorce, of vulnerability, of not arriving under the sanctioned banner of success, was an intruder in her eyes. Not a thief, even, a trespasser. The letter, the school, the neighbors, all of it was groundwork. Julia was being boxed in. Her choices reduced not by force, but attrition. A campaign of exhaustion. A war of erosion. Karen didn't want Julia gone tomorrow. She wanted her broken enough to leave of her own accord. But Julia wasn't planning to run. She had nowhere left to go. And if Karen wanted a contest of will, then Julia would oblige. She would not fight fire with fire or silence with silence. She would fight with facts and with the law and with every ounce of grit she had left. And Elliot, he would never know just how close they came to losing the one thing that mattered most. Because Julia would never let that happen. Not again. Not ever. The silence that followed wasn't the absence of noise, but a simmering tension that permeated every corner of Julia's life like a slow leak of gas. Odorless, invisible, dangerous. After the school incident, the air shifted completely. It was no longer a matter of minor complaints or subtle ostracism. Now, every glance carried weight, every knock at the door felt like a prelude. She began to notice people pausing near her mailbox, eyes flicking across the property before they moved on. Cars lingered longer near her driveway. Packages she ordered arrived opened, resealed sloppily with tape as if someone had rifled through them in transit. Her Amazon history wasn't remarkable. Books, cleaning supplies, a birthday present for Elliot. But it wasn't about what she ordered. It was about who was watching. One evening, she returned from the grocery store to find a white envelope tucked beneath her welcome mat. There was no name, no address, just the word "Consider" scrawled in neat cursive. Inside was a single page, a printed spreadsheet of local child services outcome statistics for the county. There were highlighted rows. Children relocated due to instability. Cases with unresolved parental residency issues. Flagged neighborhood complaints. The implication wasn't subtle. Julia read it once, twice, then calmly fed it through the shredder. But the message didn't leave her. She increased her contact with Marcus, now speaking every other day. Not always with new developments, but often just to verify next steps. He advised maintaining extreme documentation of everything. Calls, letters, even casual interactions. The more boring your record looks, the better, he'd said, with that dry tone that always meant he was worried but trying not to alarm her. Julia followed his advice. She kept a detailed log, reviewed her insurance paperwork, and even installed a new lock system. Not because of any break-ins, but because the small things, the ones that chipped away at certainty, were becoming routine. It was while logging into her property tax account one evening that she noticed it. Her property listing had been updated with a new status label. Review. Pending. Conditional occupancy. No explanation. No documentation. Just a quiet change in a public database that anyone in the neighborhood could access. She took screenshots and sent them to Marcus. He responded with 2 words. They're escalating. At school, Elliot was moved to a different group for his art class. No one told Julia in advance. When she asked why, the response was diplomatic: rebalancing student-teacher ratios. But Elliot came home subdued. He said the new group doesn't talk much, and that one of the kids said his mom was on a list. Julia didn't press him. She didn't want to force awareness into a place where innocence still lingered. But the line between protection and naivete was thinning fast. It wasn't until the weekend that the first open confrontation happened. Julia had taken Elliot to the neighborhood park, the small one inside the development, surrounded by neat benches and signs reminding pet owners to clean up after themselves. It wasn't busy, just a few parents and children. Elliot ran toward the swing set while Julia sat with her coffee, watching. Then she saw Karen. She hadn't noticed her arrive. She was simply there, like a chess piece slid silently into play. Karen didn't approach. She stood near the sandbox talking to another mother. Julia recognized her vaguely, a woman named Diane who had once complimented her shoes. They spoke softly, heads tilted together, casting brief glances toward Julia. Then, slowly, Karen turned and began walking in her direction. She stopped at the bench, but didn't sit. She looked down at Julia and said, "I spoke with a counselor last week, someone who's very familiar with family placement and environmental factors." Her voice was even, almost pleasant. "We talked about children and how their stability is tied to the predictability of their home life. You understand, I'm sure." Julia said nothing. Karen continued. "Sometimes it's not about whether a person is dangerous or negligent. Sometimes it's about what's appropriate, what's best. There are people who specialize in these evaluations, experts." She paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "They don't need court orders to initiate inquiries. They can respond to concerns, especially collective ones." Julia didn't flinch. "Are you making a threat?" Karen smiled faintly. "I'm making a suggestion. This house, this situation, was never meant to be permanent, and Elliot deserves permanence, doesn't he?" She didn't wait for a reply. She walked away, back toward the other mother, who handed her a water bottle as if nothing had happened. Julia left the park 10 minutes later, but the weight of that conversation lingered long after the sun set. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the living room, lights dimmed, laptop open, reviewing every line of Elliot's school paperwork, every medical form, every clause in the estate documents regarding the house. She called Marcus the next morning and asked, "How fast can we secure a formal affirmation of guardianship? I want it on file. I want it public." He didn't ask why. He just told her which forms to prepare. By Tuesday, they had filed notarized confirmation of custody status, along with a proactive affidavit affirming permanent residency. It wasn't legally necessary, but it would shut down certain avenues of speculation. Karen, of course, didn't let up. 2 days later, Julia found a flyer taped to the front gate. At first glance, it looked like a standard community newsletter. There were even gardening tips on the back. But the inside included a spotlight on civic responsibility, listing vague examples of residential misuse and abuse of inherited property privileges. There was a generic photo of a house, hers, but altered enough to allow plausible deniability, and a paragraph about evaluating child development in transitional households. No names. No dates. Just poison, distributed like confetti under the guise of community information. Julia took it down and filed it away. She didn't shred this one. This one would matter. It wasn't until Friday that something finally snapped. Julia arrived home to find the back gate open. She always closed it. Always. Elliot had a habit of leaving it ajar, but she'd taught him to double-check. She walked the perimeter, heart pounding, but nothing was stolen, nothing broken. Then she found it, just behind the hydrangeas. A small plastic bag. Inside, a plush toy. Not Elliot's. It was a lamb. Worn. Familiar. She had seen it before. Once, in a box of donated toys at the neighborhood center. How it ended up on her property, she didn't know. But there was a tag stitched crudely into its neck. In red thread, someone had embroidered a single word. Soon. She didn't call the police. Not yet. She photographed it. She bagged it. She sent the images to Marcus. Then she told Elliot they'd be sleeping at a hotel that night. Just for fun. Just for a break. He didn't ask why. He was used to her mood shifts now, though she tried to hide them. She wanted him to feel safe. She didn't want him to know how unsafe things had become. Marcus called the next morning. "I'm filing a civil protection motion," he said. "If we can tie this to a harassment pattern, we can force a disclosure from the committee about internal communications. But we'll need evidence, testimony, witnesses, anyone willing to talk." Julia thought about Diane, about the other parents, about the barista who now served her in silence. No, they wouldn't talk. Not yet. But the walls were closing in, and Karen had overplayed her hand. This wasn't just a campaign anymore. It was personal theater. And Julia, she wasn't waiting to see how the third act ended. She was preparing the next scene herself. And this time, it wouldn't be quiet. The morning after Marcus filed the harassment motion, Julia awoke with a sense of foreboding she couldn't quite name. It wasn't a physical sensation or even a tangible anxiety, just a slow, creeping awareness that something, somewhere, had already begun shifting again. She dressed Elliot, packed his lunch, and drove him to school herself instead of letting him take the bus, pretending it was a special treat, when in truth it was the only way she could be sure no one had access to him without her knowledge. The school office had grown cooler since the earlier concerns had been filed, but no one denied her presence or her role as his legal guardian. That was something. For now. Back at the house, she made coffee and sat at the kitchen table staring at the pile of documents Marcus had helped her prepare. They had redundancy, clarity, timestamps, witness sign-offs, everything needed to withstand administrative scrutiny. But what they couldn't fight was suggestion. People believed what they wanted to believe, and in a neighborhood like this, belief was currency. Karen had understood that from the start. Her tactics had never been about brute legal force. They had been built on quiet erosion, on manufacturing a context where Julia's continued presence felt off-script. That afternoon, a knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, she was met by two men dressed in business casual, collared shirts, windbreakers, clipboards tucked beneath one arm like an accessory of purpose. They introduced themselves as representatives from the Neighborhood Liaison Committee, a title she didn't recall seeing in any documentation. Their tone was friendly but invasive, every question framed like a courtesy but laden with implication. They weren't there on official business, they said. Just a routine wellness check, a touch point with residents to gather feedback. Julia played along at first, answering in clipped but polite responses. Her body half-turned as if to signal she wasn't inviting them inside. They asked about Elliot, how he was adjusting, whether he'd made friends, whether she felt the environment here was supportive of modern family structures. That last phrase made her stiffen. When she asked whether the visit was tied to the harassment complaint, one of the men offered a practiced chuckle. "Not at all. We're simply collecting perspectives to ensure the neighborhood remains a stable and harmonious community." She didn't let her face move. Not even a twitch. But she asked for a business card. They didn't have one. That, finally, made her shut the door. Julia immediately called Marcus, who confirmed that no such committee had formal standing in the development's governance structure. They're working under a separate umbrella. Probably something Karen or her allies formed informally but with enough jargon to sound official. Be careful. If they're showing up without records, they're fishing." That evening, Julia changed the locks again. A few days later, the first formal response to the harassment claim arrived. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't even a rebuttal. It was a polite redirection, a vague acknowledgement that community members occasionally act with undue enthusiasm, and that any discomfort experienced by residents is sincerely regretted. It was a dismissal cloaked in apology. A non-answer. Marcus was livid. "They're banking on your fatigue. They want you to drop it out of sheer exhaustion. Don't." But Julia wasn't about to drop anything. That week, she made an appointment with a therapist, not for herself, but to begin establishing a paper trail affirming her parental stability and mental soundness. She wasn't unraveling, but she wanted it documented that she wasn't unraveling. It wasn't about therapy. It was about defense. The therapist, a shrewd woman in her 50s with piercing eyes and zero tolerance for nonsense, understood within 10 minutes what was happening. "They're cornering you without touching you," she said. "Classic power by proxy. You're smart to come in." Julia left the session feeling neither better nor worse, but sharper, as if something in her spine had crystallized. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning. Julia and Elliot were walking through the community center, the one with the gymnasium and multipurpose room where seasonal events were held, when a display caught her eye. On the bulletin board near the front entrance, someone had pinned a collection of laminated pages labeled "Legacy of Community." It featured family photos of residents, past and present, alongside short descriptions. Smiling couples, children in holiday sweaters, black and white shots of original homeowners breaking ground with ceremonial shovels. And near the bottom corner, a candid of Elliot on the swings. Julia froze. It was taken from behind, but the angle, the close, the timing. She remembered that day. She had taken Elliot to the park herself. She had been the only one there. She hadn't posted the photo anywhere. Next to the image, a caption read, "Local child, temporary placement. Neighbors extend warmth during time of transition." That one line stripped her cold. It wasn't just invasive. It was a declaration, a lie, cloaked as information, disseminated with community approval. It told anyone who read it that Elliot didn't belong to her, that she was a placeholder, that her presence was subject to expiration. Julia ripped the page off the board. No one stopped her. That night she sat across from Marcus at his office, the laminated sheet lying between them like evidence from a crime scene. "This isn't rumor," she said quietly. "This is intent." Marcus nodded. "We move now," he replied. "We file not just for protection. We demand a cease and desist on public misrepresentation, and we request an emergency mediation hearing. If they want to weaponize the narrative, we make them accountable for every word of it." Julia nodded slowly. She had never asked for war, but if they wanted to test what she was willing to defend, she would show them, and she would not blink. The days leading up to the emergency mediation hearing unfolded with a slow, suffocating pressure, the kind that sinks into the bones without ever breaking the surface. Julia maintained her routines, preparing Elliot's breakfast, attending his parent-teacher conferences, walking him to the park as if nothing had changed, but inside her, something had hardened. Not bitterness, not even anger, but resolve. She was no longer just responding to a problem. She was preparing for siege. Marcus had worked relentlessly in the background, compiling documentation, witness statements from the few neighbors willing to admit off record that Karen had been organizing discussions about Julia's fitness as a resident and mother. Most declined to be cited, of course. They feared the consequences, the quiet retribution that came not as retaliation, but in the form of social removal. No invitations to barbecues, no help when the sprinkler system broke, no access to the social infrastructure that governed every inch of the neighborhood's day-to-day life. That was how people like Karen operated. She didn't need to control you directly. She just needed to make sure everyone else did. Julia felt the tension acutely in Elliot. He had begun waking at night, crawling into her bed without a word, clutching the stuffed whale he'd had since he was 4. He didn't say what scared him. He didn't need to. The air had changed. Even a child could feel it. At school, one of the boys had told him that his house was going to get new people soon. Another asked if his mom was going back to the city. Julia met with the teacher, but the conversation went nowhere. Everyone was cautious now, as if proximity to her might leave a residue. Then, without warning, came the second official visit. Not from the liaison committee this time, but from a woman who identified herself as a family stabilization officer. The title meant nothing to Julia, and she told her so directly. The woman was polite, well-dressed, and equipped with a tablet on which she typed everything with rapid, neutral efficiency. She asked to speak with Julia privately, then asked, softly, as if it were just curiosity, if she could speak with Elliot, too. Julia refused. The woman didn't push. She left a card and said, "We've received multiple community wellness concerns. It's probably nothing, but we're required to follow protocol." Julia handed the card to Marcus. He called the office listed, only to find that it was a subdivision of the local council's volunteer outreach network, non-governmental, non-binding, entirely powered by referrals. Legally, it meant nothing. Politically, it was a minefield. The mere suggestion of oversight, even informal, could fuel Karen's entire narrative. 3 days later, a group of residents submitted a formal petition to review the long-term allocation of non-owner-occupied residential properties within the community. On paper, it sounded like a zoning issue. In reality, it was a barely veiled attempt to draw attention to Julia's inheritance status. She wasn't an original buyer. She hadn't invested in the community. She had arrived by accident, by loophole, and they were building the case that her continued presence was a form of administrative error. Marcus filed a preemptive challenge, citing discrimination based on housing origin, and attached 3 years of state statutes to the response. But Karen escalated again. The community newsletter, ostensibly run by a rotating group of volunteers, but in practice dictated by Karen and her close circle, published a piece titled "Invisible Impact: How Transitional Occupancy Affects Neighborhood Stability." The article didn't mention Julia by name, but quoted anonymous residents, discussing the discomfort caused by temporary dwellers who resist integration but expect full privileges. It featured a chart showing property values in similar neighborhoods where inherited occupancy correlated with perceived decline in communal cohesion. Julia read it 3 times. She didn't feel rage. She felt calculation. The article wasn't for her. It was for everyone else, a soft permission slip to continue excluding her under the guise of economic pragmatism. Marcus suggested they strike back publicly, publish a response, distribute a counter-narrative. Julia declined. "That's what they want," she said, "to turn this into a debate. I'm not going to defend my right to exist." Instead, she pushed forward with the hearing. It was set for Thursday afternoon, held at the development's administrative building, a modern glass-paneled structure with the sterile charm of a bank lobby. Karen arrived in a cream-colored suit, flanked by 2 neighbors Julia barely recognized. She didn't speak to Julia, didn't even glance at her. She moved with the confidence of someone who expected victory not because she deserved it, but because she believed others lacked the courage to deny her. The hearing began with procedural statements, an acknowledgement of the complaint, a review of Julia's legal standing, and an outline of what the board was permitted to adjudicate. Julia and Marcus sat on one side of the polished table, Karen and her allies on the other, There were no raised voices, no outbursts. Everything was calm, professional, and quietly vicious. Karen presented her arguments as concern, her suggestions as compassion. "We simply believe," she said softly, "that the neighborhood deserves residents who are committed to its values and engaged with its culture. When someone is isolated, it hurts everyone, including the child." The last word hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Marcus didn't respond emotionally. He presented documentation, timelines, sworn affidavits, and a summary of harassment incidents supported by photographic evidence. He cited the laminated community center bulletin, the unrequested wellness checks, the manipulated school narratives. He made it clear. This was not about Julia's fit as a resident. This was about a coordinated campaign to remove her under the guise of propriety. The room was silent when he finished. One of the board members, a man in his 60s with the tired eyes of someone who had sat through too many petty grievances, finally said, "It appears this situation has grown far beyond its original scope." Karen smiled, which is exactly why it needs resolution. The board recessed to deliberate. Julia stepped outside, the afternoon heat sticking to her skin like a second layer of sweat. She didn't talk to Marcus. She didn't want words. She wanted this to end. After 27 minutes, they were called back in. The board's decision was measured but clear. There would be no action taken against Julia. Her residency was affirmed, her status uncontested. The petition regarding property allocation was deemed unrelated and dismissed. But no sanctions were issued against Karen. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just a recommendation. That both parties refrain from further escalation and seek community-based resolution where possible. Karen didn't look at her as she left. She didn't need to. Julia had won, technically. But she knew what the board had really said. Survive, but do it quietly. That night, someone left a package on her porch. No note, no markings. Inside, a used child's jacket stained with dirt, missing a sleeve. Julia didn't flinch. She picked it up, walked into her backyard, and lit it on fire. No reaction, no calls, no message sent. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction, but something had changed. She no longer felt like she was defending herself. She felt like she was preparing for something else entirely. The days after the hearing passed not with relief, but with a sharpened tension, like the aftermath of a gunshot that didn't hit, but changed everything. Julia had technically prevailed. Her rights had been affirmed, her presence declared legitimate, her custody uncontested. But the atmosphere around her had congealed into something darker. There were no more flyers, no more committee visits, no more passive-aggressive wellness inquiries. That part of the game was over. But what replaced it was worse. Nothing. Complete and deliberate silence. A void that swallowed everything she said or did. Neighbors who used to at least nod in her direction now averted their eyes. At the coffee shop, the barista didn't call her name when her order was ready. Just placed the cup silently on the counter. At Elliot's school, other children were no longer cruel to him, but they weren't anything else either. They didn't talk. They didn't play. He came home quieter every day, and Julia saw him begin to fold into himself like a child preparing for winter indoors. It wasn't bullying. It was omission. She had become invisible, and in this place, invisibility was the first stage of erasure. Marcus urged her to stay alert. "Karen doesn't need another hearing," he said. "She just needs time. Her strategy now is attrition. Make things unbearable until you walk away voluntarily." But Julia had already passed the threshold where leaving was an option. This house wasn't just property anymore. It was the line in the sand she had drawn when the rest of her life had been taken apart. She had lost a marriage, a business, her privacy, her social reputation. She wouldn't lose this. She couldn't. But resolve had its limits, and Julia was nearing hers when the unmarked van appeared outside her house. It came in the early evening, just as the sun dipped low and threw long shadows across the street. It didn't park directly in front of her house. It was too smart for that, but 3 doors down, positioned just far enough to seem like it belonged there. The engine didn't turn off. No one got out. It just sat. Julia waited, watched, took photos. The van came back the next day, and the next. Always a different time, always a different position, but always within view. She sent the photos to Marcus, who said what she already knew. It was legal to park on a public street. Unless someone gets out or engages, we have nothing actionable. But then something did happen. Julia returned home one afternoon to find that Elliot's backpack, normally hung neatly on the hook near the door, was missing. She hadn't left it at school. She hadn't taken it out. And then, 3 hours later, she found it. Not in the trash, not in the yard, but placed carefully inside the mailbox. It had been opened, its contents rearranged. Nothing missing, nothing damaged. Just touched, moved, disturbed. She didn't tell Elliot. She didn't want him to know. But she changed every code in the house that night. 2 days later, she came home to find the house alarm blinking. The code had been entered incorrectly 5 times. Then, correctly once. But no one had broken in. Nothing stolen, just silence and blinking lights. She called the company. They said someone had accessed the system remotely. Julia asked who. They couldn't tell her. But they did confirm that the access hadn't come from her registered IP. That was the moment she stopped pretending that this was just social warfare. This was psychological destabilization. Karen had moved into a new phase, one where documentation and complaints were replaced by implication and fear. Julia doubled her security, installed motion lights, subscribed to real-time surveillance uploads. But even so, she couldn't sleep. Every sound became a possibility, every shadow a signal. Elliot started sleeping with his shoes on. She didn't tell him to. He just did. As if preparing for the moment they would have to leave in the night. And then came the tipping point. One evening, as she took out the trash, she noticed something stuck to the underside of her car. At first glance, it looked like debris. But when she crouched closer, she saw it was a small plastic object, a tracking tile, the kind used to locate lost keys or phones. She didn't touch it. She photographed it, then called Marcus. He told her to call the police. She did. They came, polite but skeptical, logged it as a possible device placement, took it for analysis, and left without offering anything beyond routine procedure. She knew it would lead nowhere. But the point hadn't been police involvement. The point had been to make her feel hunted. And it had worked. That night, she took Elliot to a hotel again. She didn't sleep. She watched the security feed on her phone. Nothing happened. Nothing ever did. But the threat lived in the waiting, in the unprovable, in the space between knowing and being able to prove. Marcus began preparing a broader legal strategy, something more aggressive, something involving civil liability for emotional distress. But it would take time. Too much time. It was Elliot who finally forced the shift. He had been quiet for days, but one evening he asked her if they were the bad people now. She said no, of course not, asked where that came from. He said one of the kids at school told him, "People like you don't last here." That night, Julia didn't light a candle or cry or vent into her pillow. She opened her laptop, created a password-protected drive, and began compiling everything. Every letter, every photo, every timestamp, every time someone hovered too long, every time something was moved or altered or touched. She added her own commentary, objective, neutral, emotionless, not a manifesto, a record. She wasn't building a case anymore. She was building a legacy. She didn't know if she would win. She didn't know if she would outlast Karen, or if the system would eventually turn against her in ways even Marcus couldn't prevent. But she knew one thing. She would not be erased in silence. If they were going to destroy her life, they would do it in daylight and with witnesses. She was no longer waiting for justice. She was demanding consequence. It didn't end with a confrontation. Not the kind Julia had once imagined during those sleepless nights when adrenaline whispered promises of justice and revenge. It ended the way real wars often do. Not with victory parades or a final act of defiance, but with attrition, exposure, and one small slip made by the side that always believed itself untouchable. Karen had grown too confident. After months of carefully coordinated harassment, after maneuvering the narrative so effectively that most neighbors now believed Julia to be either mentally unstable or temporary, she had grown careless. The mistake came not in a dramatic move, but in an email, one that was never meant to reach Julia, but did. It had been forwarded accidentally by a committee assistant who had meant to share an unrelated notice about landscaping ordinances. In that thread, buried among mundane logistics, was a message from Karen to 2 other residents. The text was short, almost dismissive. If she's not gone by June, we'll have to escalate visibility. I don't think the boy will withstand it much longer. Julia stared at the words for a long time, not because they shocked her, nothing Karen did shocked her anymore, but because they were finally tangible. Proof. Clear intent. Not just gossip, not just concerns, but strategy. Targeted emotional pressure, explicitly referencing Elliot as a point of vulnerability. She forwarded the message to Marcus. His response came within minutes. This changes everything. Within 48 hours, he had filed a new motion, this time not just for harassment, but for coordinated psychological endangerment of a minor. It wasn't criminal, but it didn't need to be. Civil suits carry their own kind of power. The kind Karen couldn't dismiss with charm or maneuver around with policy talk. The kind that named her publicly, officially. She was served papers in her driveway. Julia didn't watch it happen. She was inside, making dinner for Elliot. He sat at the table, sketching in a notebook with that quiet intensity he always had when he was trying to process something too large for words. She didn't tell him what had happened. She didn't need to. The tension in the house began to shift. In the weeks that followed, the silence of the neighborhood changed in flavor. It wasn't the cold indifference of before. It was the wary observation of people suddenly uncertain of where to stand. Julia noticed that one of the women who had once backed Karen's newsletter initiatives now looked away when their paths crossed. Another neighbor, a man who had once accused Elliot of leaving trash near the park bench, offered to help Julia carry groceries one morning. She declined politely, but she knew what it meant. They were recalibrating. Power was moving. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. Karen, meanwhile, retreated. She stopped attending meetings. Her smile disappeared from public spaces. Word quietly spread that her attorneys were advising a full withdrawal from community leadership roles. There was talk, nothing concrete, about a possible move. Julia didn't care. The damage had been done, and no relocation would rewrite the months she had lived under siege. But she took a quiet satisfaction in knowing that Karen would no longer control the script. She would no longer be the voice people deferred to when questions were raised. That era was over. The lawsuit never went to trial. Karen settled. The terms were sealed, but Julia knew what mattered. The admission of misconduct, the commitment to cease contact, and the formal retraction of all previous community concerns that had named her or Elliot. It wasn't public in the way justice sometimes is in films or books, but it was complete. Final. Unmovable. Julia didn't celebrate. She didn't tell Elliot, she just resumed life. Slowly. Intentionally. She helped him decorate his room with new posters. She baked more. She started taking evening walks again without glancing over her shoulder. And one morning, months later, she found a note tucked inside her mailbox. Not anonymous this time. Signed by Diane, one of the mothers who had once stood beside Karen. It was just a single sentence. "I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner." Julia didn't respond. She didn't need to. Some battles are fought in silence. Some victories don't require acknowledgement. That evening, as the sun set behind the rooftops and Elliot laughed from the backyard where he played without fear for the first time in months, Julia finally let herself exhale. She hadn't just survived. She had endured.